When I try to explain evolution to creationists, one of the many problems is that they don't realize how many species there are or were. So they're not aware of the gradual fluidity between the myriad forms that paleontologists and zoologists see all throughout phylogeny. And then, instead of anything that evolution really is or calls for, defenders of the faith demand to see one kind of thing changing into a completely different kind of thing, something so radically different that it's not even related to its parents. That's not evolution. That's a magical transformation. That would actually violate two of the natural laws of evolution. Yet believers argue against descent with inherent modification, which is what evolution really is, by complaining that it's not a change in kind or a change of kinds, which is their straw man fallacy. They distort evolution into what it isn't so that they can keep themselves confused and avoid the risk of understanding what they're forbidden to believe. These wanna pretenders will not remedy the errors in their perception either, no matter how well or how often you correct them. You can cite all the authoritative, definitive sources you like. It won't matter that no textbook or lecture teaching evolution ever said anything about a change in kinds. No, believers still going to believe that that's what it is because that's what they need it to be. They won't define their terms either because they know they won't hold up, and because they know that they can't go to a zoo and tell you how many different kinds are, how to know how many different kinds are represented there. They have no idea because the word kind is undefined, so it's literally meaningless. Now, the way the Bible describes kinds allows for two possible interpretations. One is that a created kind is the same as a species, according to the biological species concept, meaning that if two individuals can interbreed to bring forth fertile offspring after their kind, then they're the same kind. So if created kinds and species mean the same thing, then macroevolution is impossible because macroevolution includes the origin of species. And according to this, new species can only come about on the earth as an act of special creation by God. That is the way that created kinds have historically always been understood by religious believers until relatively recently. However, creationists have now begun to realize that they have to accept that speciation happens naturally, not just because it's already happened so many times that it's impossible to deny it anymore, but also because they need speciation in their attempted defense of the flood, so that Noah didn't have to have so many millions of animals on board his mythical ark. He could just have a relative few kinds, and that all the vast variety that we have today could have evolved from there. Although that means that macroevolution would have to happen many times faster than microevolution can. Another problem is that the Bible says that birds are not a kind. Actually, it says that there are all kinds of birds of every sort, whatever a sort is. It even says that there are different kinds of ravens and different kinds of hawks and so on, dropping back to the species level again. In this context, then, a kind is the same thing as a clade because it is applied to multiple levels. That means that a taxonomic grouping of all the descendants of a common ancestor. A clade is the common ancestor and all of its descendants. That way, birds can be a kind, and there can be several kinds within a kind, including different kinds of ravens and different kinds of hawks. The difference between a clade and a kind is that God created the original ancestor of each kind. But creationists will never explain how to tell whether two similar-looking animals are the same kind or different kinds, because they can't point to an original animal that is unrelated to anything else. And they don't want to admit to a common ancestor for that whole clade either, because in some sense that proves evolution. So if they want to play that game, fine. We cannot give them one kind changing into a completely different kind, because that's just not remotely even like what evolution ever was, despite all their protestations and distortions. But if they want evolution to mean one kind leading to different kinds, fine. We can give them exactly that and then use it to show what evolution really is. When Carolus Linnaeus published his taxonomic system in 1735, he had all known life forms arranged into a series of categories. But even though he was a creationist in the sense that he believed that every species was a result of a special creation by God, he noted that the various life forms did not line up side by side like they should if they were separately created, unrelated to everything else, which is how creationists typically and historically imagined kinds. Until they realized that there were way too many animals alive today to fit onto Noah's Ark, to say nothing of fossil fauna amounting to 100 times the genera that we have today. Linnaeus didn't know about all that. Instead, he noticed how all of his taxonomic groups were in a sequence of subsets from multiple tiers of parent categories. To put that another way, what he saw was a branching lineage, a series of daughter groups descending from ancestral sets in a pattern that looked like a family tree. This made no sense from his perspective. He couldn't understand it. It would be another century later before Charles Darwin explained what Linnaean studies revealed. Darwin had the advantage of being a world traveler studying biodiversity around the globe, and he had the added advantages of both paleontology and microscopy, neither of which were available to Linnaeus. In Linnaeus's day, it was commonly thought that everything was either animal, mineral, or vegetable, just the three categories. Linnaeus was a botanist, so he started out by classifying plants. He figured out a family tree for them, and then he revealed another, entirely separate family tree when he classified animals too. In an attempt to make sense of these two trees, he divided them each into 7 tiers, starting with what he called their kingdom, then phylum, class, order, family, genus, and species. And each of these ranks got its own name for whichever family, genus, or species we're talking about. But now, today, nearly 3 centuries later, with all we've learned since then, we count at least 10 times that many, nearly 70 named clades in the human evolutionary lineage so far, with some other clades that have already been identified but that haven't been named or described yet. And it's funny that creationists always ask for transitional species, every incremental step from microbes to man, which these 68 or so clades represent. But at the same time, they really don't want to see any of that, and instead demand that a bacteria turn directly into a man. Not even a population level change, but over many generations, just a bacteria turning into a man, an individual human within a single lifetime. Something that is not remotely even like evolution at all. Now, my systematic classification of life series covers these dozens of intermediate stages, these kinds of kinds. But that's a 50-part playlist that goes into a lot of other details too, and that's hours of viewing. I can't expect believers to watch that when all they've asked for is an evolutionary sequence from microbes to man. So the next time they ask me for that, I'll give them this explanation, which is summarized about as much as I can abbreviate and still make sense. If at any point you want a more detailed explanation, check out the longer playlist linked below. Our taxonomic tiers should first encompass all that is alive as contrasted with what is not. And that's not always obvious. Viruses, for example, do not qualify as living even though they can be killed, kind of like zombies. So our first tier is biota, distinguishing the living from the dead. And already both of the Linnaean trees for plants and for animals move into the same category of living organisms. Similarly, there were a few microbes known back then in 2 different sizes, with tiny unicellular things like amoebas and paramecium becoming a 3rd kingdom, Protista. And then they were extremely tiny things, which we now know of as bacteria, being classified in a 4th kingdom, Monera. Then in 1969, scientists recognized a 5th kingdom for fungi. It was in my lifetime that they realized that Protista was so much more diverse than they thought that it might actually qualify as several kingdoms all by itself, and that one kingdom has since been reclassified into more than a dozen supergroups. They also realized that bacteria were distinctly different from everything else, such that it forced us to look at them as another completely different category, contrasting the empires of Prokarya and Eukarya. And I remember when the news broke in 1977 of the discovery of archaeobacteria, extremophiles capable of surviving in extreme temperatures and conditions that mere bacteria could not. Archaea are superficially similar to bacteria in size and simplicity of structure, but radically different in molecular organization. So different that they should be classified separate from bacteria. This again meant that we needed a higher category than kingdom. And I was actually taking a college course on evolution in 1990 when they proposed domains as a parent category over kingdoms. Thus, the separate domains of bacteria are the prokaryotes, which are not a formal clade, and every other kingdom are all necessarily classified together in the domain eukarya, which is a formal clade. Now, why is one of them a legitimate taxa and the other is not? Because we have to classify things by what they are, not what they are not. Eukaryotes have their DNA contained within a nucleus. Prokaryotes do not. Prokaryotes consist of two dramatically different domains, not just one. And almost every eukaryote cell, except for the most primitive of them, includes bacteria in it. Most of the cells in your body are not your own, and the cells that are yours still have bacteria inside them. What evidently happened is that one of these earlier eukaryotes somehow enveloped or engulfed a form of rickettsia bacteria in such a way that both cells survived and maintained a mutually beneficial relationship, with the host cell providing for the bacterial guest that became mitochondria. We know that because mitochondria has its own DNA, bacterial DNA, which is in a circular pattern rather than the linear double helix that we usually see. Mitochondria pays for its room and board by producing chemical energy for the cell in the form of ATP. The host and tenant cells even replicate at the same time together so that their symbiotic relationship is maintained throughout all their descendants. Then, as eukarya diverged into myriad subsets, one of those daughter groups eventually was involved in another mutually beneficial instance of endosymbiosis, this time engulfing a form of cyanobacteria, which pays for its room and board by performing photosynthesis. So now we have all of these cells that are powered by mitochondria, and then we have this one subset of these cells that also have chloroplasts. Then, as that new form diversifies into their myriad subsets, one of their daughter groups eventually led to plants. Thus, the domain Eukarya is the parent category of both plants and animals, what Linnaeus thought of as two separate kingdoms. Linnaeus would have been fascinated if he could have lived long enough to read about all of these discoveries. So we start with the 7 Linnaean ranks, from here anyway, and we've since had to insert several dozen more new ones into the gaps between the existing originals. So you're alive, a living organism. What kind of organism are you? You're eukaryote, because your cells have a nucleus. Even your blood cells initially, though they lose that later on. There are different kinds of eukaryotes, being basically divided between biconts and uniconts, depending on how many flagella they have. Most cells have flagella, which are like little spinning hairs that can be used to push or pull the organism along. Now, there can be a cluster of these hair-like appendages on the front or on the back, or they'll have just one in the front and one in the back. These are called biconts, and this is how plants are, with one in the front and one in the back. One of the most basic clades of eukaryotes, however, is amorpha, named for the shapeless amoeba-like forms at their base. But it includes you too. The defining characteristic is that their cells, your cells, are unicont, identified by having only a single flagella. Not all of your cells do, but the first one does. The gamete cell from which you came, or your dad did. And in turn, that's how you come about. We're talking about spermatozoa, the single cell from which we all started. And what kind of amorphous unicont are you? Obozoa, which is a sister group to amoebas, a cluster of clades that are not amoebas. There are 3 different kinds of obozoa, including opisthocont, where that one flagella is in the posterior or pushing position. This is not just the case for animals that start out as sperm. It's also true of fungi that start out as spores. Yet Carolus Linnaeus once associated fungi with plants, but it turns out that they're closer to animals than to plants. So what kind of opisthocont are you? Your holozoan, which has biological figuration that is closer to animals than to fungi. There are different kinds of holozoans too. Your philozoa, because each of these subcategories also represents an evolutionary descent, and all of them so far have developed different aspects of sexual reproduction. Even prokaryotes can employ a type of horizontal gene transfer called conjugation, though that is just a superficial similarity. Some of the earliest or most primitive known eukaryotes have also demonstrated aspects of meiosis. And at this point in our eukaryotic phylogeny, our ancestors looked a lot like sperm. But now we know of philozoan organisms that can be asexual and reproduce through mitosis, like everything else did up to this point, or they can also reproduce sexually, again, using a form of horizontal gene transfer but is limited to gametes alone. So what kind of philozoan are you? A poikizoan. Every one of these subcategory classifications matches evolutionary expectations, just as philozoans may be sexual, or perhaps they're becoming sexual. Poikizoans are becoming multicellular. The poikizoans that we can study in the lab today may be unicellular, or they may be multicellular. And we're not just talking about communal clusters either. We're talking about cell differentiation, where we can see choanoflagellates becoming epithelial cells, which then give rise to gametogenesis. So this is the move to multicellularity. It's happened a couple dozen times in different lineages, including a couple of laboratory demonstrations. But this is when it happened for us, a couple billion years ago. There was a time when an amoeba or paramecium was considered a single-celled animal, and some dictionaries still refer to them as single-celled animals. But in proper biological terms, there's no such thing as a single-celled animal. Animals are multicellular by definition. And it's no longer called Kingdom Animalia, it's Kingdom Metazoa now, but it doesn't matter that they changed the name. You can still call it Facebook, Twitter, Animalia. It still means the same thing. Multicellular eukaryotes with an internal digestive tract. We're heterotrophs. We can't make our own food like plants can. We have to ingest and digest living cells in order to survive. So our very existence depends on the death of other things. And some people get upset about being classified as animal, citing the Bible, which is ironic because Ecclesiastes 3 says that men are but beasts and that we have no preeminence above other animals. It even says that the only reason we don't admit that we're animals is because of our vanity. Now, there are many kinds of animals. At the moment, we're talking about animals that are so simple you might not even recognize them as animals, like sponges and placozoans and that sort of thing. So what kind of animals are we? Eumetazoa, which means advanced animals, more advanced than parazoans. And what kind of advanced animals are we? Bilaterally symmetrical, having a discernible front and back, top and bottom, left and right. Some animals have a radial symmetry. Others have no symmetry at all. One of the Precambrian phyla had a symmetry that was based on alternating isomers. Another had a threefold symmetry. But we bilaterians have forward and reverse, up and down, starboard and port. And what kind of bilaterians are we? Nephrozoans. That means that while other animals like jellyfish and sea anemones take food into their mouths and then have to poop it back out of the same hole, nephrozoans have a tract that goes all the way through, so we can dump it behind us and not have to put up with that shitty aftertaste. And this digestive tract relates directly to the kind of nephrozoans that we are. Mollusks and arthropods and such are protostomes, meaning that once the egg is fertilized and the blastopore begins to develop, the very first feature that appears is the mouth. And then the mouth gets deeper until it goes all the way through to the anus at the end, where it should be, at the end. But we're deuterostomes, and that means that development goes the other way, such that the very first feature ends up being the anus, which then gets deeper until it comes out of the mouth. Now, the amusing thing about that is that while protostomes are for a moment just a mouth, kind of like Pac-Man, you're a deuterostome, which means that in that same moment, you are literally just, So the next question we ask is, what kind of asshole are you? I mean, what kind of deuterostome are you? You're chordate. Why? Because you have a spinal cord. In addition to the nervous system, we also have evidence for the different stages of the evolution of the circulatory system, which began with the heart beat, then veins, then blood, then the heart itself, being a central cavity of the main vein, which is still responding to an already ancient pulsating rhythm. But the definitive characteristic of this clade is the spinal cord. And what kind of chordate are you? Olfactorious, meaning chordates with nostrils. What kind of olfactorious are you? You're craniate, because you have a skull. And what kind of craniate are you? Vertebrate, because vertebrates are craniates with vertebrae, a backbone. Actually, vertebrates are the only things that have a backbone, just like craniates are the only animals that have skulls. Because evolution at every level is a matter of incremental, usually subtle, superficial changes being slowly compiled atop successive tiers of fundamental similarities. Exactly the opposite of a change in kinds. Instead, each new clade is the old clade with all of those old diagnostic characteristics, plus this new trait too. Like when you start with vertebrates, they already have skulls, and then we add a new trait, like jaws, for example. So now we have a new kind of vertebrates called gnathostomata. And watch out, they bite. What kind of gnathostomata are you? Eunathostomata. I mean, you are Eunathostomata, which means the advanced type, the new and improved model. What kind of Eunathostomata are you? Osteichthyes, which means that instead of having a skeleton made of cartilage, your skeleton is calcified into bone. If we were to take a left turn here, that would become a different kind of Eunathostomata, chondrichthyes. That's the clade leading to sharks. But we're not chondrichthyes, we're osteichthyes, also known as crossopterygii, which are osteichthyes with legs, having at least the first stage of leg development, as well as lungs, the earliest of which were asymmetrical, being adapted from the swim bladders of our fishy ancestors. And what kind of Sarcopterygii are you? Rhipidistan, which means that you have two symmetrical lungs. What kind of Rhipidistan? Tetrapodomorph, meaning that your funny bone articulates in the socket of a skeletal shoulder. Eotetrapodiforms are tetrapodomorphs with all the bones that are currently in your arms and legs. Although when they first started out way back when, they were shaped very differently and there were more of them. Elpistogalia is a clade where the new trait is the loss of an old trait. We are tetrapodomorphs with no dorsal fins, just a pair of pectoral limbs attached to shoulders and another pair of limbs attached to some sort of pelvis. There are two kinds of those. One of them, Stegocephalia. They also lost their bony gill covers, which is why you don't have them, and they're known for the pelvis having a bony connection to the spine. Stegocephalians are tetrapodomorphs that also have wrists and elbows and fingers. So what kind of Stegocephalian are you? You're a tetrapod, having four limbs that are skeletally adapted for life on land. What kind of tetrapod? Reptiliomorph, which does not mean that you're a reptile. What it means is that we're typically pentadactyl, although the gene for 6 fingers is strangely somehow dominant. And we have keratinized, waterproof skin, unlike amphibians who just absorb foreign chemicals through their skin through osmosis. Being reptiliomorph also means that where fish breed by the male releasing a cloud of sperm near to where the female has released her clutches of eggs, and if they're close enough, they'll have a successful chemical experiment. Amphibians do the same thing, except that as the eggs are coming out of the female, the male is right there, right on top of her, coating those eggs with the content of his character. They have to be in water to do this. Fertilizing an egg requires 100% humidity. So how do reptiles and the rest of the terrestrial vertebrates do this on dry land? Well, remember how the frogs mate right on top of each other? Well, there's one way to get even closer, to literally get under her skin. And that is with a probing appendage that pumps the baby juice right into the nursery. So if you have such an appendage, or are receptive to it, then you are reptiliomorph. And there are two kinds of reptiliomorphs, amphibians and amniotes. Amniotes have eggs that can survive dry land conditions by developing the fetus in a shell of, or a sac of amniotic fluid. And there are two kinds of amniotes. Sauropsida is a group of extinct forms plus reptiles, while Synapsida is another group of extinct forms plus us. Synapsids are recognized by having a temporal fenestra, a hole in the skull right behind the eyes. It's closed up again in humans, but the remnant of it is still visible in our profile. And there are a few different kinds of synapsids, including Eupellicosauria, identified by having mammalian skull traits like different sizes of teeth. And one kind of synapsids are sphenacodonts, whose jaw hinges don't just open and close like doors, they also have enough flexibility to allow us to chew. And what kind of sphenacodont are you? You're a therapsid, having the ability to warm your body like through shivering. And then eutherapsids are the more advanced type, whose vades do the shivering, which keeps their bodies slightly warmer than their surroundings on a cold morning. Neotherapsida are the new type that are not only warm, but they have a gait that is more mammalian. They walk one foot in front of the other without their legs splaying because their spine has changed from a serpentine to an undulating flexation. And one kind of neotherapsid are theriodonts, known for their mammal-like teeth, specifically referring to their fangs, which are first seen in earlier forms like Dimetrodon. But theriodonts can, on occasion, grow saber teeth. They also have a chamber in their nasal area for mucous membranes. And they also set the mammalian standard of always having 7 vertebrae in their neck. That's you, your dog, elephants, even giraffes, all have 7 neck vertebrae. And of course, eutheriodonts are the advanced kind. They also have a complete secondary palate so that you can still breathe while you're chewing a mouthful of food. Then eutheriodonts evolved a new kind called cynodonts, which again are known for their canine teeth as well as a reduction in their abdominal ribs. And the dentary part of their jaw is now made of all one piece, where it used to be made of multiple bones fused together. The other bones that used to make up a fair portion of their jaw are now just tiny bits at the very back of that jaw. I have to mention that because it'll be important later. Oh, and cynodonts have a heel on their hind feet. Then they evolved epicynodonts, and they're known primarily for differentiated cheek teeth. They're more like mammals. They've completely lost their abdominal ribs, allowing for a diaphragm, and they also lost the third eye that many reptiles have conveniently right on the top of their heads, but that was in disguise so that you probably never noticed it. Eucynodonts are a new kind of cynodonts, and they evolved into probaenonathans. And we can compare their skeletons to see transitions from each of these moving through taxonomic generations to see how these features are becoming more mammalian step by step, wherein all these extra jaw bones are not even structural anymore. They're just tiny little slivers at the back, just at the base of the ear. That'll be important in a moment too. Prosostrodontians are a kind of probaenonathans with double-rooted cheek teeth coated in plesiomorphic prismatic enamel, as well as a bunch more refinements toward mammalian forms, which is the next stage or kind. Mammaliomorpha, whose cheek teeth are precisely occluding. These evolved into mammaliforms, who are sometimes born toothless, implying that they drink mother's milk, and they're diphodont, meaning that they had a set of baby teeth that are replaced only once, and the adult set has to last a lifetime. True mammals are a kind of mammaliforms, a different kind of the same kind. The final diagnostic feature is that the hinge of the jaw has shifted from articulating with the quadrate bone to the squamosal. For a few of these previous taxonomic generations, they had double articulation, but the quadrate continued to shrink and recede until it became one of the bones of the inner ear. So, what kind of mammal are you? You're theriomorph, which is recognizable by the fact that you have external ears, and just like only theriomorphs do. And theriiformes are a kind of theriomorphs that are a different kind from their sister group, the multituberculates. They're typically diphodont, with the exception to the third molar in humans that doesn't appear with the baby teeth. It only shows up later as an adult. Theriiformes are the ancestral or parent category of Trichnotheria, which have modifications in the elbow, the scapula, and the heel that allow for improved movement in our arms and legs. Cladotheres are a kind of trichnotheres, but with the modification of a 270-degree coil in the auditory canal, which is a bit like a bugle. This is an auditory improvement that other kinds of mammals didn't have. Zatharia is one kind of cladothere, but instead of sweating milk out through their pores like the more primitive mammals, Zatherians have nipples. Tribus finita is one kind of Zatheria that no longer have a cloaca, where the colon and vagina have now separated into different channels, because it used to be one tube for everything. And then therians are a kind of Tribus finita that give birth live rather than laying eggs. And then eutherians are a kind of therians whose young are born in placenta. And then curiously, placentalia is a subset of eutherians that have lost the epipubic bone, which is common in metatherians. And this loss allows for a larger channel so that the babies can be born larger and thus more developed. And boreoeutherians are a kind of placental mammals that typically have a dangling scrotum. And then Eukaryotic liars are a kind of boreoeutherians where there's a genetic rather than a morphological link between the two clades. The clades being gliers, which include rodents, and euarchontids, which have a long list of adaptations for increased balance, dexterity, skill, and binocular vision and depth perception. And primates are archontids with fully enclosed optical orbits and opposable thumbs. Haplorhines are primates with dry noses. And Anthropoidea, also known as simiiformes, are a kind of primates that don't have sensory whiskers anymore, but that do have color vision and two pectoral mammae, a naked and pendulous penis, and a large brain intelligent enough for tool use and language comprehension and deliberate deception, as well as self-awareness and of mortality. In other words, humans are a kind of monkey. And what kind of monkeys are we? Catarrhinae, old world monkeys with downward pointing nostrils and flat fingernails and tails that are weakened or diminished or absent altogether. And what kind of old world monkeys are we? Hominoids, also known as apes. They have no tails at all, and their shoulders are capable of a full rotation and brachiation, meaning that we can hang or swing from our arms in a way that other monkeys can't do. And there are two kinds of apes, lesser apes and great apes. We're great apes, even if we do say so ourselves. We all have the same eyes, fingerprints, and ears like no other animal except apes. And what kind of great apes are we? Hominines, great apes that walk upright. It's not just that we have the same morphology. It's not just that we found all the intermediate fossils we'd ever need to see, in abundance, by the way, but we even have complete genome sequences acting like a sort of paternity test to prove that we definitely are a kind of ape. Which raises the question, if we didn't come from apes, why are we still apes? We're from the ape kind. That's the family to which we belong. A lot of creationists say that their level of kinds start at the family level. Well, we're in the family Hominoidea. That's the superfamily. The family level is Hominidae, and that is the great apes. So what kind of upright walking great apes are we? Humans. The point is that there was never a point in our entire evolutionary history when we changed into another fundamentally different kind than our parents. Evolution is summarily defined as descent with inherent modification, usually referring to an allelic variance in reproductive populations over many generations. That means that every new taxa that ever evolved was just a modified version of whatever its ancestors were, and it still belongs to every parent clade that they did. I just named over 6 clades to which you and I still belong to every one of them. There were once a few different kinds of humans in the genus Homo, but now there are only sapiens. In our arrogance, we named ourselves Homo sapiens sapiens, man the wise, the wise. Then, having no idea yet where we really came from, we made up our own origin stories, myths of pure imagination, often starring gods that we created in our own image, and we foolishly believed our own fabled folklore, even to the point of making up excuses to lie and deny all the evidence of who and what we really are. So maybe we're not all that wise after all. I could put that more bluntly, but again, I'm trying to be kind.